Okay, so we're going to talk in this unit about computer mediated communication. We've already looked at a couple of areas of computer mediated communication, for example email, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen, but we're going to consider some of the other types of computer mediated communication that have been used in various ways in language teaching over a number of years. Computer mediated communication is a very commonly used title for this area, and underneath that we find some other terminology that we might consider and we'll look at in a bit more detail later. Generally we refer to Web 2, Web 2.0 and social media increasingly are the terms of choice. Web 1 being older types of technology, and Web 3 being technology that's coming in, what's sometimes called the semantic web. It was interesting, I picked this up at a recent conference, and interesting to see how pervasive in the world we find different tools like Facebook, although interesting to see that in different countries still other technologies are also relevant, and what's most important I think about the map is how how much it's spread, and although there are a number of exceptions in the world, it's pretty much all pervasive. I think a thing to bear in mind is that while terminology still has its value, we could say that they blurred in some ways. So what we might have referred to as synchronous, real-time communication, and asynchronous, which is communication that occurs not in real time, that's become increasly difficult, and maybe it might be more relevant to talk about that's I suppose discourse that is that is face to face, if you like, or where you're actually communicating in speech, and communication where you're communicating much more in text. So you can see, although in places like, I don't know, for example like Second Life, you are going to be communicating both in speech and text at the same time, in the same way that you might do in Adobe Connect. So even that's not a terribly satisfactory distinction, but things have changed, things have become more difficult to separate. So whereas in the past we talked about speech having certain characteristics and text having certain characteristics, the lines are very much more blurred now. In terms of how these tools are used, there have been developments over time. So in the early part, we certainly saw, in early research, we saw people looking at more traditional language learning tasks, for example jigsaw or information exchange tasks, and we can see a table here from Pika 1993, that where people were looking at this kind of activity in the regular language classroom, as well as in the computer mediated communication classroom as well. So work came from that part of the second language acquisition world and came into computer mediated communication. We see increasingly work on collaborative activity, so particularly in writing, which we looked at in the last unit, but we see problem-based learning and task-based learning, particularly task-based learning in language teaching, so people doing tasks using tools online. And we see as part of that, a development of that, or an extension of that, is the kind of intercultural computer mediated projects that somebody like Robert O'Dowd talks about. Now, Robert O'Dowd's done a recent article which is well worth reading if you're interested in the development of telecollaboration, as he calls it, Partly he calls it that, I think, because he comes, he's lived and worked in the European framework, and it's interesting to read about the development, showing how how it sort of starts pre the internet, with people kind of exchanging information, writing letters to each other back in the 1920s, developing through network-based language teaching, as Warschauer and Kern decided to call it. I mean, the early work of Warschauer using email, and other colleagues. Ruth Vilmy is another name of somebody who had a lot of activity using email going on in classes around the world. But as we see there from his chapter in the 2013 book, not everything went to plan, and we find the students not really engaging in an intercultural way. We find them rejecting the foreign way of thinking, and the particular sort of being quite stereotypical about the what was going on in the information that was given by the other part of the exchange. We then see the development of tandem learning, which, if you don't know what this is, it's where people get together and exchange languages. So I would find somebody to help me with my French, and I would help them with their English. And then the development of what we might truly call telecollaboration, where students work online doing particular tasks. And O'Dowd describes two different projects there, one about analysing video and another one about doing ethnography. These developed into other kinds of activities, which involved using quite complex questionnaires to explore different cultural aspects of the different communities that were communicating. And Thorne now talks about the idea of web telecollaboration too, where it is, as well as having closed groups talking to each other, we bring in other parts of the community as well. And a good example of that, which you'll find in my edited book in the chapter by Graham Stanley, is a case study of Ayat Al-Tawal, who works in Cairo. And you'll see, if you read this through, I'm not going to read it all out, but you see that this started off as being an exchange using Skype, and developed into quite a complex area, with the parents getting involved and so on and so forth. So these are now potentially very complex activities that people can engage in. We see various areas of research having been explored in the field of computer mediated communication. We see different, the way that people produce, produce language or communicate in different modes, differences between synchronous and asynchronous activity, the difference when you introduce 3D into that, or you have what are called multimodal spaces, where you have text and spoken language going on at the same time. We have work that looks at the negotiation of meaning. We have looking at particular communication strategies. Are there particular communication strategies we find online? We look at differences, whether the task design is changed, and whether learner and teacher roles change in online context, sort of breaking down the traditional IRF pattern, the initiate, response, feedback pattern that's been true of classrooms for millennia. We have research into motivational autonomy, and also collaborative practice that we've talked about before. There are inevitably some challenges in computer mediated communication, and this is partly because we find this breakdown between regular written material and spoken material, and we see that in certain situations, like this presentation here is much more formally spoken than it would be if I was just talking generally about this, and we see increasingly the way that written language is affected by the more informal nature of the spoken language, that it resembles in some ways, because it's not formal language. We see the increasing use of "so," for example, at the beginning of sentences, even in quite formal, informal kind of contexts. So another thing, I've just done it. CMC removes, or at least reduces, other para and non-linguistic linguistic aspects of face-to-face speech. So we see that it's quite difficult to replicate in text the sorts of things that happen when you communicate face-to-face. And you find on the other side of the coin, you get emoticons coming through, increasingly little pictures and all sorts of stuff that's added into the text to help people understand it. And it's difficult, of course, to really effectively understand written text, because you don't have the nuances that are there in the spoken language. There's not the help that's given when you kind of say something and somebody looks at you and quizzically sort of shakes their head and says, "What are you talking about?" It's very difficult to replicate that in written text. If you want to read more about that, you can have a look at the article in Smith there. Of course, always in the background has been second language acquisition research, and a lot of work. For example, if you look at this Jepson article, the notions of negotiation of meaning, which have been around in second language research for a while, clearly a focus for computer mediated communication research, looking at whether these conversations enable people to negotiate meaning more effectively. And further than that, we see this list that was originally produced by Chappell back in 1998 are also areas that people have looked at in research into computer mediated communication of one type and another. We see then that that we're interested, as Kern and Warschauer point out, that we're not just interested in linguistic competence, but other kinds of competencies as well. So you can see these described in this quotation from Omaggio, and I'm not going to read that out. You can read through that yourself. But particular linguistic competencies can be developed in the in the computer-mediated communication environment. And on the other side of the coin, if we think that these discourse communities are where increasingly our students are going to work and engage with, then we should be including them in our classes. We should be teaching people how to write email, not letters, how to communicate effectively in Skype, how to do a presentation online in Adobe Connect, for example, if that's the sort of thing that students are going to be expected to do, not necessarily standing up in front of a class with a PowerPoint. Again, if you want, there's actually an interesting example again in one of the chapters in my edited book, where we find a politician being trained to use Skype to talk to his to do presentations to the people in his constituency, and increasingly this is the sort of thing that people ask in that kind of ESP type class. When we start thinking about tools, there are some other issues that we might consider. The affordances, this commonly used term, or attributes of different tools, and what difference they make to the actual language production. So we have the notion of temporality. It takes time. We can, in some contexts, we can be anonymous, so it's argued in some situations that anonymity helps people to hide behind a character and produce language more effectively. We've got different types of text, mixed together, text, audio, and video, and we've got the notions of spatiality. The closeness that you are to people and the distance that you are from people, and the impact that has on language teaching or language learning or language production, in fact. These are all areas that we can explore in different spaces. So we can look at something like proxemics in a space like Second Life, for example. Lamy talks about the affordances of particular synchronous spaces and the sorts of things that we need to think about. The actual the way that the interface and the use of the hardware has an impact on communication. Perhaps the philosophies that underpin the design of the tool. A tool might be locally created to meet certain needs, or it's been chosen by an institution to meet a particular need. Within a particular space, we might have different social relationships enabled, it might be that the actual power distance relationships are reduced in particular spaces, or it might be that because the tool is deployed by a very powerful organization, that that the reverse is the case. And then finally, the particular learning situation where this actually occurs. So we've moved away from spaces like Language Lab, increasingly moved away from them to people's offices or homes. So if people are using technology to study, they're often using it in an environment where they're more comfortable, and perhaps this has this particular affordance of a tool being able to sort of sit in your own study room at home, makes you feel more comfortable and more engaged with the actual the use of the language. You feel more like doing it than if you're kind of on display with 100 other people in a language lab.